This story begins behind closed doors, not on the campaign trail, not in the public spotlight, but in the hidden machinery of power, where legal strategy, political calculation, and personal crisis converge. Imagine a room filled with lawyers, aides, strategists, and key allies of one of the most polarizing figures in modern American history. A room where today's breaking twist in a legal battle has just struck, triggering shockwaves that will be felt not just in courtrooms, but in political corridors, in media studios, and in living rooms across the nation. This is the story of how a lawsuit twist suddenly spiraled into a shocking crisis behind doors, deeper, more consequential, and more fragile than the headlines suggest. We begin with President Donald J. Trump, now back in the White House since January 2025, and still embroiled in a dizzying array of legal battles that stretch from civil courtrooms to federal appeals, and even to the Supreme Court. These aren't isolated lawsuits anymore. They have become a defining feature of his presidency, a political strategy, a legal labyrinth, and in many ways a looming crisis that threatens to reshape not just his political fortunes, but the very institutions of American law and governance. Over the past year, Trump and his organization have filed and faced hundreds of lawsuits, from classic political defamation claims to highly unusual actions against federal agencies. One of the most explosive developments in the past week was the filing of a $10 billion lawsuit against the Internal Revenue Service and the U.S. Treasury Department, a legal offensive that, on its surface, seems almost unprecedented. Trump alleges that a former IRS contractor illegally leaked his family's tax records from 2018-2020, causing reputational and economic harm. What's extraordinary isn't just the size of the claim, enormous even by Trump standards, but the context. The plaintiff here is the sitting president suing the federal government itself. To understand the full gravity of this moment, we have to go deeper, beyond the rhetoric, beyond the tweets, beyond the surface of headlines, and into the psychological and institutional breakdown that this legal strategy reveals. In most presidencies, lawsuits are external, brought by citizens, organizations, or political opponents, but Trump has inverted that norm. He's using the courts proactively, not just to defend against charges, but to attack institutions that are meant to function above politics. The IRS, for example, is a pillar of the federal system, charged with administering tax law fairly. A sitting president demanding billions from that institution strains not just legal precedent, it tests the limits of presidential power. Behind the scenes, senior White House aides privately express alarm. One advisor, speaking off the record, described the IRS suit as a political gambit that is blown up in strategic terms, putting the administration on the defensive at a moment when it can least afford it. In internal memos that have circulated among Republican allies, there is concern that this particular lawsuit, magnified by its sheer audacity, has shifted the narrative from policy debates to questions of presidential judgment, risk, and even stability. This is not mere speculation. Multiple legal analysts now describe Trump's current litigation approach as reactive, erratic, and disconnected from traditional constitutional guardrails. Rather than focusing on a handful of core cases, Trump's legal team now manages dozens of suits filed by and against the administration and Trump personally. According to court records and reporting, hundreds of lawsuits were filed challenging actions taken by his administration through 2025 alone, many of which have landed at the Supreme Court. And here's where the twist and the crisis truly begins. What changed in the last 72 hours is not just a new filing, but what that filing did to the dynamics inside the West Wing. Sources tell us that key advisors were caught off guard by the IRS complaint, not because they didn't expect litigation from Trump, but because no one in the inner circle anticipated a legal assault of this magnitude coming from the president against the federal government he leads. This fractured the administration in ways that are now visible to anyone who watches the corridors of power. According to close observers on Capitol Hill, lawmakers, even Republican allies, reacted with stunned silence when briefings began circulating that the White House counsel's office had approved the IRS suit without broad clearance from cabinet departments or senior legal advisors. This is not the usual Washington legal strategy. It reads more like a personal vendetta writ large, and that perception is now shaping internal confidence. Critics in the GOP caucus privately warn that the lawsuit has overtaxed an already strained relationship between the White House and Congress, undermining trust just as budget negotiations and major policy fights loom on the horizon. To make sense of the fallout, we need to unwind the psychological narrative of the man at the center of it all. Donald Trump is a figure who thrives on confrontation. Throughout his entire career, long before politics, he embraced conflict as currency. Legal battles weren't obstacles, they were stages on which he performed. But now, in the 9th year of continuous litigation, and as both litigant and defendant, that conflict has begun to consume him. The presidency is no longer the single most powerful institution he controls. The courts are. And yet, paradoxically, the courts have become arenas where his authority is most deeply challenged. Take, for example, his recent defamation lawsuit against a major media outlet, reported widely last year, where he sought $15 billion in damages over coverage he says damaged his reputation. The case attracted enormous media attention because of its scale and ambition, but it was dismissed by a federal judge as procedurally defective, forcing Trump's team to refile or reconsider their strategy. But the IRS suit is different. It has reverberations beyond media conflict and political grudge. It puts the presidency against the Treasury Department. It elevates a personal legal battle into a constitutional question about separation of powers and presidential reach. Critics argue this is not just about leaked tax documents. It's a power play that tests the core of administrative independence. Back in that enclosed room where Trump's inner circle is now reeling, conversations are grim. Some allies whisper that the IRS lawsuit has inadvertently turned the full force of the federal bureaucracy, career lawyers, tax experts, and senior officials, into adversaries rather than civil servants. That's a dangerous proposition at any political moment, but especially when the nation faces pressing challenges at home and abroad. And now there are ripple effects. Federal appeals courts and district judges are already bracing for an unprecedented legal cascade. One appellate court clerk described the docket as chaotic, with dozens of Trump-related cases moving simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions. What makes this chaotic isn't just volume, it's strategic inconsistency. Some suits appear highly tactical, others almost symbolic, and a few dangerously expansive. The IRS suit falls into all three categories. The White House press office has issued terse statements, framing the IRS lawsuit as a vindication of privacy rights in government and an effort to protect American citizens from unauthorized leaks. But the messaging hasn't calmed concerns. Even some conservative commentators, typically loyal to Trump, have questioned the optics and legal footing of suing federal agencies while serving as their commander-in-chief. This unfolding crisis is more than legal technicalities. It is transforming political alliances. In the past week, at least 2 Republican senators, previously staunch Trump supporters, have publicly called for clearer justification of the IRS lawsuit, emphasizing the need for rigorous constitutional review before the executive branch takes such action. In Washington, that's an extraordinary moment. Party loyalty colliding with institutional anxiety. To fully grasp the enormity of what's happening, let's rewind just a few months. In 2025 and into early 2026, Trump's legal world saw an array of high-profile cases. There were ongoing civil fraud claims from state attorneys general alleging years of financial misrepresentation. There were challenges to executive orders on immigration and birthright citizenship that reached the Supreme Court. And just months ago, a class action lawsuit challenging deportation orders under ancient statutory authority drew intense national debate. All of this built a foundation of legal tumult, but none of it shook the presidency quite like the IRS lawsuit has. Inside the West Wing, the mood has turned from defiance to something more precarious: uncertainty. When litigation was defensive, defending Trump against claims in other jurisdictions, the narrative was that of a besieged outsider fighting the establishment. But now, Trump is the establishment, and the establishment is fighting back, not as a faceless opponent, but as an institution tasked with accountability. This inversion is where the crisis truly lies. Bottom line, for decades, Donald Trump used lawsuits as a tool, a weapon even, to reshape narratives, intimidate foes, and assert personal power. But now, in the most consequential legal twist of his presidency, that strategy may have backfired. It has created a legal environment that questions not only the wisdom of the action, but the stability of the presidency itself. This is not about red states or blue states anymore. This is about trust in institutions, respect for legal boundaries, and whether the leader of the free world can turn those same institutions into instruments of personal conflict. What happens next remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: behind the closed doors of power, a crisis is unfolding, one that will shape not just headlines tomorrow, but the architecture of American law and democracy for years to come.